Okay, welcome back to the channel, guys. You're here with another episode of Med ABCs, Acing Basic Concepts, right? Okay, so today's topic is the homunculus, right? Now, what is this homunculus? The homunculus is a miniature man, right? It's a miniature human that they've drawn to represent different parts of the brain responsible for motor and sensory functions, right? Primarily, guys, we're talking about the cerebrum, right? Where we find what we call the motor and sensory cortices, right? The cortex, right? So now, before we dive into the homunculus, let's take a basic look at the anatomy of the relevant structures, right? So firstly, guys, if we take the general picture, right? We have the cerebrum here on top, we have the cerebellum, right? And then we have the midbrain, right? The pons and the medulla, right? And down here, we have the spinal cord, right? With the spinal segments. Now, what do I want you all to understand here, guys? When we talk about sensory and motor functions, right? Motor is always descending fibers. They start somewhere in the brain. We're going to see where. If they start somewhere in the brain, they come all the way down. There are areas where they cross. We call them the pyramidal decussation. We'll talk about that later. Right? They cross over and they come to the spinal cord, and finally they exit out of the spinal cord at these spinal segments, right? Where they go and they innervate a muscle at the neuromuscular junction, right? So that's the motor system. Considering the sensory system, what happens? We have what we call ascending fibers. So if, let's say we have a hand here, right? And we have a sensory nerve, right? This sensory nerve comes into the spinal cord and it ascends up. Right? Through its track. We'll talk about where they cross. Different tracks cross at different levels. We'll talk about that later. Cross and they travel up all the way to different areas of sensory perception in the brain, right? Here we're going to talk about something called the sensory cortex, right? Okay. So with that basic understanding, if I take the cerebrum, I'll take a smaller diagram here, right? One of the major things you're going to first see is this black line. This is what we call, guys, the central sulcus, right? This right here is the central sulcus. Now, I want you all to get the 3D picture of this, right? A 3D picture, as in, if we consider this brain, right, to be something like a globe, right? So I have a globe right here, right? So this dot, I've drawn it to demarcate the anterior aspect of this globe. So if I have the globe pointing at you, right, the brain pointing at you, right, the central sulcus is somewhere here on the side of it. And if you take a top-down view, this is what the central sulcus looks like, right? Top down, it just looks like a horizontal line, right? Now, I want you to get this 3D structure to your head, right? What is the importance of the central sulcus, guys? The central sulcus, right? Just adjacent to it, there are some very important structures. Now, when we call something a sulcus, right? What do we mean by that word? A sulcus is a groove, right? This is a groove, an indentation into the brain parenchyma. Now, you all know the brain parenchyma is not a smooth structure, right? We get grooves, we get bumpy areas, right? These grooves that go inward into the parenchyma, these are called the sulci. So if I draw the brain parenchyma basically like this, these inward grooves, these ones, these are called the sulci. Now, what I want you all to notice, we also have some bumpy regions, right? Some bumps, right? This is a bumpy region, okay? Same as this one. Now, these are what we call the gyri, right? Or the gyrus, singular, right? So the two hemispheres on the outside, on the cortex, right? They are composed of sulci and gyri. So what I want you all to notice here is whenever there is a sulcus, right? Whenever we have a sulcus here, on either side of it, we have gyri. In the same way, guys, here we have the central sulcus. And on either side of the central sulcus, right, front and the back, we have gyruses. We have two gyri. Right? If we look at the gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, right, this gyrus is called the precentral. It's in front of the central. So we call it the precentral gyrus, right? The precentral gyrus. Then there's another gyrus behind, right? Behind the central sulcus. This is what we call the post-central gyrus. So this precentral gyrus and this post-central gyrus is very important. Why? That is the crux of our lesson today, guys. The precentral gyrus is our primary motor cortex, right? There's the post-central gyrus. This is our primary somatosensory cortex. Now, what are we going to do? We are going to take a cross section, right? Through this central sulcus. Let's say the central sulcus is somewhere here. We are going to take a cross section, a coronal section, right? A frontal cross section through this sulcus, and we're going to see what we're going to get. So if I take a cross section, something like this, right? Okay, right. So we'll see something like this probably, right? All of this, we're going to cut it out, right? So this is my cross section, right? And what we're going to end up, right? We're going to take this portion and we're going to flip it. So if this was the structure, right? We're going to take a cross section, we're going to cut it right in the middle, and we're going to open it up, and we're going to look at the center. Now, when we look at the center, this is what we are going to see, right? This is our cross section, okay? Now, what is significant here, guys? This is when we get to our homunculus. Now, what am I going to do? I'm going to draw a much simpler diagram, and I'm going to spread them apart so that we can see this clearly, right? Something like that, right? So look at this, the same structure, okay? I just drew it simply. Now, if we take a look at this, let's say this is our motor cortex, right? If this is our motor cortex, guys, our homunculus looks something like this. The feet are seen in this groove in the middle, right? We have the feet, then we have the trunk, right? A little bit of the chest, and we also have the hand. I can draw a hand. Now, this diagram that I'm drawing is not very accurate, but you get the gist of it, right? Okay, and the face. So we have the foot, the leg, the trunk, and the upper extremities, the hands, and finally the face, right? So this is our motor cortex. Now, what does this image tell you, right? What it tells you is, guys, if a patient comes in complaining, hey, doctor, I cannot move my leg, right? I cannot move. Why are we talking about movement? The motor cortex. We are focusing on the motor cortex. If the patient says, I cannot move my leg, we have to paint a picture in our brains thinking, okay, there is probably some issue, some lesion at this area, right? At this area. Then what if the patient comes and tells you, okay, no, I cannot move my arm and my face is drooping or my face is weak, right? I cannot move my face, right? Then what you've got to think is, okay, this is most likely a lesion somewhere in this area, right? Where the hands and the face is involved, right? Hands and the face is involved. So this is what we mean by the, okay, got it? Right. The next concept. So this is the motor homunculus. I will draw the sensory homunculus in a different set, right? Similar diagram, right? Very similar picture, guys. The only difference is when we consider the sensory homunculus, right? We have the foot coming in here, right? Similarly, the leg, and we have the trunk. We also have a part of the neck here, right? The neck, right? And we also have the hands, similarly, like in the motor cortex. Finally, the face, right? The face. So this is our sensory cortex, the sensory cortex. Now, what does this tell you? Just like in the previous diagram, if a patient comes and tells you, okay, I cannot feel anything in my foot, right? You got to know, you got to figure out that there is probably some issue in this region, right? Same way, if he says, doc, I cannot feel my hands and my face, right? You got to think, okay, something is wrong in this area, right? Now, what's the importance of understanding the homunculus? Now, later, we will talk about the blood supply, right? Especially when we're talking about strokes, guys, okay? So here, what I want you all to understand, just know this for now. We will talk about this in depth in our stroke chapter, right? This area, right? What we call the medial area. This is supplied by the ACA, anterior cerebral artery. And these areas, right? The lateral aspect, right? These are supplied by the MCA, medial cerebral artery. Okay, so the ACA and the MCA, right? Now, we'll talk about the blood supply again in the stroke chapter. All right, we'll use some diagrams as well so that you get a clear picture. Right? So I hope you understand through this class, guys. We've discussed the homunculus. So hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. Catch you guys in the next one.